Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of I Like to Read podcast. This is a super awesome, fun, special episode because we are joined by, I guess, my friend, my mom's friend, my friend, Jenny Altshuler. So hi, Jenny, if you'd like to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of a background about yourself, and then who knows where we're going to go on this wild ride of talking about books and the world that it encompasses.
Well, the reason I'm here is because Rachel knows from her mom and just from us talking over the last few years, we both love to read. We both read a lot, and we both love to talk to authors. I've been involved in running the Belmont Public Library author series in Belmont, Mass,
which is where I'm from.
Which is
for those who don't know,
we know each other from. So I did that. I started about 20 years ago. Did it for 15 years, and then started up this fall, like now on Zoom, because often I'm various places. So I couldn't just be in Belmont and do it as I used to. But for 15 years, we had about 10 authors a year. So I met a lot of authors in those years. And then about 12 or so, I don't know exactly how many years ago, I got involved in the Brattleboro Literary Festival in Vermont. And so I also, often I'll bring an author that I've had from Brattleboro to Belmont or Belmont to Brattleboro. So that worked out really well. So got to meet a lot of authors that way. And each year in October, the Brattleboro Literary Festival, which is now in its 21st year, it will be in October. We always say we'll have 30, but we end up having 40 or 50 authors every time. And one of the fun things is, we have an author cocktail party, an author dinner. And if you're involved in running it, you get to have dinner with, everybody.
That's amazing.
You get to meet all 40 or 50 of the authors and go to the events that they're speaking at. So that's been really fun. And I'm also now a photographer, and I'm also very involved in democratic activism. So that's what I'm spending my time on. But reading is always part of it. So let's get started on
a woman of many trades. And yes, I know that books flow into that. Let's start a little bit about just your love of books and literature. If there's, a specific moment from your childhood or specific moments that you can kind of remember, because I'm sure similar to me that, your love of books has been ingrained in you from such a young age. So if there's some moments, early memories that you can remember that have kind of stuck with you throughout your reading journey.
So I do feel like I'm someone who always was reading, always. Like I don't remember learning to read, but I just remember,
Isn't that interesting though? I can't really remember learning to read either. And for some people, I know that's like a huge thing, especially for people like who aren't, because reading is a skill ultimately. And I know for some people, it's one that just like it's a muscle that isn't as well developed. And so that's so interesting too, is like, I really don't, it just kind of feels like it was already always part of my life.
Yeah. And I do remember so I remember the children's books, and I actually remember because my brother's 3 years younger. So I think I remember books from age 3, 4, and 5 because I might have read to him or someone was reading to him. So like the Dr. Seuss, like On Beyond Zebra. I don't know if you know that one, but
maybe that's a lesser. I don't know.
It's a lesser known one, but it's really good. It's about On Beyond Z, basically. But it's letters. He made up all these letters. And so I remember. Virginia Lee Burton, The Little House, and Mike Mulligan, The Steam Shovel.
Wow, that's a throwback. Those? Yep, I loved Mike Mulligan. Yep.
Yeah, and I loved The Little House. And I am interested in city planning, which is my father's is a city planner and government professor. So I don't know if that's, where that came. I just love that book so much. And I read once that Ann Tyler has The Little House book.
That's the one where it's like it starts out as one house and then like a whole city gets built around it.
So it starts out as a country house in the middle of
right. So like the urbanization, right.
So it's so interesting, I guess, to see that could happen. Maybe I understood like somehow that's what happened in the city. That's what it once was. I'm still interested in that. I love seeing cities before and after and all that. So, but Ann Tyler has that book on her desk. I read that. Just because it's a great story, it has much in it and so much emotion and time passing and all that. So to her, it was like a model of a good story. And then the chapter books, Nancy Drew and
Nancy Drew,
and which I don't think like they just get stuck in your head. Like I'm not saying I would read them now, but like Bobbsey Twins. Did you read those?
No, I did the Boxcar Children. Those were big. The Babysitter's Club, which I know is probably a little bit after your time, but they had like a mystery subgenre of the Babysitter's Club that I was really into as well. But Nancy Drew, because there's been a lot of iterations of her. Of course, I read like the classic Carolyn Keene ones, but I think when I in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was, reading books inappropriate for my age. Be like, like 8, I was probably reading Nancy Drew, or maybe even younger. But I remember they had like a more contemporary like adaptation. So there's
So I ended up reading the old ones, which for me, I always thought it was funny that they made them newer, because to me, so I was reading them in the early 70s, 60s, 70s. So I remember that my aunt had the whole collection, and she gave it to me to read. And so I had hers from, hers were,
that's awesome.
She was a child in the 50s. So maybe from the 50s, maybe hers were earlier.
Right.
And she had the old Bobbsey twin books. So I actually read them in the old format with the way they dressed, the pictures were like, for me, an added element of it. So I feel like it must. So for you, when you read them, were they modern? Like, was it just?
I think a few of them had the like contemporary. I remember it was like The Secret of the Old Clock, where it's like the more cartoon. Yeah, those ones I do remember. But I also, from a young age, started playing the Nancy Drew computer games, which were obviously more contemporary. Right. And so that kind of, even if I was reading the older stories, like I had this more contemporary image of Nancy in my mind, because the computer games,
so interesting,
which are still coming out and which I still kind of play, and I have like had a resurgence of PC adventure games, which is like a whole other conversation, because I'm fascinated by the narrative of certain computer games, and then other ones that are more like action and like first person shooter, which my boyfriend is more interested in. I'm like not as interested in those, because like the narrative, that's a whole other thing. But the Nancy Drew computer games,
I didn't even know that.
I played those for a really long time, and I played a bunch actually during the pandemic recently and revisited them, and they're not good games. Like the storyline is interesting, but the way that the puzzles function and the way that like the playability is really terrible. Like it's really like there's certain puzzles that you can get stuck on for hours just because they're stupid and you have to look up the answers. But it's interesting
that they switch it to computer games. Like for me, me, everyone my age and younger.
Well, now there's like there was a TV show. I mean, there was a few movies, and it's interesting though that I'm pretty sure most of the TV show iterations didn't land successfully. Although the computer games, while they're not exactly like super highly reviewed and the best games, there's a huge fan following. And I know for myself and a lot of girls who grew up around the same time as me, that those games were really formative for us. And I didn't even really think about that too, in terms of like the contemporariness of Nancy Drew, because she's sort of like an ageless. I mean, I'm imagining the original author, Carolyn Keene. I don't think she's alive anymore. Is she?
She was not one author. That's
what I say. She was a pen name, right? So it wasn't.
No, she was a group. There was a syndicate.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
The Bobbsey twins and Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, and maybe some other ones. It was all
just like a sense. So Carolyn Keene is not a real person.
No, I think there was a head writer for that, but it was all
that would make sense, because they're kind of formulaic. And
so they'd have a formula or the stat to plot. And anyway, so those, which I guess I'm just thinking those and other stories, like kids I would just read and read it.
Right. They're kind of like episodic TV shows. It's like watching another episode of Scooby-Doo, which I also loved. And then I don't know if they were a thing in the 70s, but I also remember, I loved like Lizzie McGuire and, arguably more like guilty pleasure TV shows. And they had novelizations of those TV shows or of those books that I loved to read too. And it was kind of like reading, not necessarily a script of the TV show, but it was like, some of them were episodes that were already out, which was even weirder. I'm like, it's a story of.
They always would do that. Like if there was a movie that wasn't a book, a lot of movies start like the Poseidon, which is a movie from the 70s. It was also a book by Paul Gallico, but then often there'd be like another version that was
that made it like off of the movie. And I'm like, this is interesting, the way that we're layering stories.
Did you ever read E. Nesbit as a child? Those were British.
I have to look. What did she write?
She wrote, The Railway Children, which I didn't really like, but she wrote a book called The House of Arden and Harding's Luck, which are like.
It really sounds familiar, but I don't think that I did. But she looks very interesting.
She was interesting. She was good. And then there's a book when my friend Constance gave me a book. She told me 2 books that I love so much. One was Tom's Midnight Garden, which I love time travel. That involves some time.
I do like time travel a lot, yeah.
And also Charlotte Sometimes, which also involved
I don't know if these are like titles that I think I've heard of, but I don't think I've read them.
Really, really good. And we read them again on audio with my kids, and they were just so good. And my husband was like,
they hold up still. I love that.
I think Tom's Midnight Guard, like, we all were. I mean, like, I don't know if the kids were, but we were. They're so poignant and great. And the other one from my childhood, Anne of Green Gables.
I never got it. I I never got into it. I don't think I read it. And that's another thing too, that I feel like I am probably pretty biased in the sense that like a lot of the old classics, like, and maybe it's like the school curriculum, but like I am just such a contemporary girl. And I know that that's like
for me, I only read contemporary now. I basically,
it's hard to like even read something from 20 years ago. It feels like vintage almost. And I know that's terrible.
I don't know that I would say that, but like for me, I do read new books. So I am.
Well, there's so much new stuff coming out,
and I love the new, and I love the new authors. And as I said, having met them so many, I mean, I've met almost every author that you can meet in my life now. So except for a few that I never did meet, but almost everyone that I'd ever want to meet. So I often would, but then I have special authors that I always want to read their books because I like so much. So their new books come out.
Or I often find a book that's new and I found it somewhere else. So I'll read it and the author, it's usually not there. I mean, sometimes it's their debut, sometimes it's not. So then I'll be like, oh, there's 2 other books that they've written if I like their writing style.
So that almost counts as one of my favorites who I read first 50 years ago or so was maybe I read, I don't know, 45 years ago, but like when she Joyce Maynard has written memoir and also fiction. So I had read her essays and her nonfiction. And then one week I was in Vermont by myself and I listened to all her books on audio, mostly that she read. And one book that became a movie, her son read. It was really great. And so sometimes I'll just do that, like go into, like I've known me for a really long time. And then just sort of, I didn't read all these books. I think
like their entire archive. You sort of look into,
And I just was there cleaning up, closing up the house and like listening all the time, constantly on audio. So that's where like it feels contemporary because it's an author that is new and now, but I'm reading the other books.
Yeah, I guess I'll make an exception in that case too. I mean, there's some older, there's like Joyce Carol Oates, like I love her and I read a lot of her new stuff, but I've read some of her older stuff too. I mean, she's been around for a while.
I got to meet her a few times.
Oh my God. She's probably, her Twitter presence is pretty crazy. So she seems like a fun one.
All over there, but it's really fun. So what was I just going to say? Oh, so my mother gave me a lot of these books. So my mother told me, read the Bobbsey Twins, Nancy Drew. I don't know if she even gave me Anne of Green Gables, but then I was going to tell you that. So when I was a young teenager and a later teenager, I basically read every book that my mother had in the house. So I've read all the books of the 70s, like what an adult woman would read in the 70s.
Like that was your teenage life.
That was I'm not saying didn't read some kids' books, but I just picked up every book. You probably,
it's like a library in your house.
She read all the time. So there's a lot of books into my 20s, even where like I would just pick up those books and read them. So it's sort of funny because it was curated. I wasn't thinking it was curated.
Right. But it was.
It was. And often she would give me books too. I mean, she was a reading specialist actually. So she would
I didn't know that.
Home books and I mean, I feel like when as a parent, it's just sort of putting the books in the house, like putting them down somewhere.
And then you don't, that's what I mean, forcing, because that's where it becomes to like the element of choice too. I think that's where different topic, but I mean, stemming from why people don't like to read and back to curriculums too, like we're forcing kids to read books that are maybe not interesting to them, maybe don't fit the right writing style, especially if reading is challenging. I know that length sometimes too. I mean, reading Romeo and Juliet as a 9th grader. And then I just remember like so terrible. I don't know if your sons had the same teacher, but this one English teacher who I won't name, but she would do quotation tests, especially for like something like Great Expectations, where it's just a random quote from the book and you're supposed to use like context clues to figure out who said the quote. And I'm like, this is like a 200-year-old or what? I'm like, that's not fun for a 9th grader. And this was not like AP English. This was just, honors English. And I'm like, that doesn't really, now it's fun to underline quotes and analyze it and unpick it. But as someone who's like just trying to make my way through Great Expectations, which is not an easy book to read, and looking back now is like a very archetypal formative book for a lot of different plots and things, but it was really ruined for me. And even Romeo and Juliet, like I didn't really appreciate Shakespeare until I left school and didn't have to rely on like No Fear Shakespeare, like that kind of stuff.
Well, I'll tell you that so I didn't really like, I don't love Shakespeare, but the first time I really appreciated and really enjoyed Romeo and Juliet was when my son was in a production when he was in 9th grade in Vermont in a summer production with really great actors, kids who a lot of those kids ended up becoming, professional actors later. It was just so great. And all the quotes and everything. And like my other kids were younger and like acting out the sword fighting and this action.
I mean, it is a great,
and that made it fun because someone in the family, like we saw it 3 times and it was fun to sort of see the actors and that in a simple production, where you weren't really thinking I have to read this.
Right. And I mean, that's what's different. I think
study it. It's just like, it was fun to see the kids acting and Jake had a small part and that was really fun. But I wanted, Great Expectations, which I actually really now love.
Right. As an adult, you realize it's a great book.
So they read it. And I read it again when they were reading it, because it is such a part of the ninth grade curriculum.
Literally, why ninth grade?
And I liked it. Like, I thought it was so great. And I had sort of liked the plot before, but I don't know how they felt. I have no idea what they thought of it, but I, as an adult, could enjoy it then, and think about it. And so I agree. I guess they have to make the kids read something. That's the thing.
Right. But I think there's so many,
the testing you're talking about,
the testing and also the way they approach the book, because I think the plot is great. There's so much richness to it. But I remember for Romeo and Juliet, like we did, I think it was when they first meet, the famous scene that we literally like acted it out in our class, and they like filmed it or something, back before like YouTube was a big thing, but that made it so much more fun and interactive. And anytime that we really got to play with the concept of like more than just the words on the page, like I think that's what was really frustrating about it to me. It's like vocabulary. It's like, can you identify this word? I'm like, that's not teaching me to be a strong reader.
So when I would read the books that my mother had around the house, and I read all the time, I don't even think I was fine in school, but honestly, I would always read. Me
too. I'd always want to finish things early. I'd always have my book with me. Whenever we had free read, like people would be like, ugh, I'm like, or when we had indoor recess, I'm like, yes, I just get to read.
And even at home, like that would be something I would do more than, I did the homework, but like
I'd rush through the homework so I could get to my reading.
I loved reading and I did, but I was going to say, I didn't look up words. Now it's easy to do because even if you're not read, even if you're reading a book, you just have your phone.
Right. Or if you're on the Kindle, you can literally press on the word. And
I know.
Look it up for you.
And I will do that even if I want to press, even when it's not on a device, you're like,
right.
But I didn't look them up. So I think that in a way, like I did know from context clues what things meant, but I do think if I had been the kind of person who thought I have to look up every word for myself, just reading some Faye Weldon book, I remember this book about Dorothy Parker called the title is You Might As Well Live, because that's one of her poems. It's a line from one of her poems about how hard it is to kill yourself. So what the hell, you might as well live. But it was the title of the book. So like you reading all these books, I didn't understand them. I didn't understand all the adult themes and just who I was reading. Of course,
how could you? But
I also didn't look up the words very much. I don't think I did. I know I didn't. 1 out of 100.
Well, that's a lot more effort to then go to the dictionary
you do know what's going on,
right? And it takes you out of the story.
That's what it is. Yeah,
I think that's the same thing with a conversation. Like maybe if it's someone I know really well and they're using a word, I'm like, I don't really know what that means. That doesn't happen very often. But if you hear someone in a movie or if you hear someone in a conversation, you're not going to stop them and say, "Hey, what does that word mean?" Like it interrupts the flow and
conversation,
right? And it's.
Yeah, you must have a great vocabulary though by now with all the reading, and I must too.
Yeah, I like to. Sometimes I remember a few years ago at my old job, someone asked me to describe myself in one word, and I said nuanced. So sometimes I'm like, there's certain words. They're not even like big words, but I like to I try to avoid saying like things or good. Like I like to use other words or like melange, melange or melancholy, and also the way that they flow off of the tongue too. Cause you appreciate the literature and I really love prose and poetry. And so
I think if we're not studying for a test, you could read every book.
Totally.
Because that would be old fashioned for me, at least reading the old ones, like old fashioned words, like a coupe or a car. Right. Or something. Or
if you're reading, I read a lot of multicultural books. And so often there will be words from other cultures that I don't recognize, but I don't really look it up. And then, cause I'm like, okay, what is that certain kind of food? Or then I'll read the glossary after.
Know it's like
but it's, that's part
that culture.
As human beings, we don't know everything. And that's part of the fun of reading is because it's also like your interpretation of it. It's not an article for you to analyze. That's fun. And that's a different type of approach to reading. And that's analytical and that's research, but we read for fun and we read to make sense of what's on the page for ourselves. And the way you interpret that word and the way it means to you is going to maybe change the meaning of the story. And that's kind of cool. That's what's beautiful.
But I think at some point we must have pretty good vocabulary.
Yeah.
So it's not suggesting that we're not understanding the book. It's just like one word in a long paragraph. Basically,
we can, because of the long, but you can still, and also like naturally your context clues, just as you read more, it's something subconsciously, you're just going to kind of piece it together or you don't let it remove you as much from, that's what I kind of feel too. I think for other people, maybe they're like, I can't make sense of this, or I'm not going, and it takes them out of it. Whereas for me, I just, just keep going.
So I would figure it doesn't matter. And someone might figure, I just read in this last chapter 3 words I don't know.
Right, maybe that's the clue to everything.
Or
right.
It's too hard for me, or I don't. Maybe.
Right. That's another is maybe they're turned off by it. Yeah. I think I've discovered there's also words that maybe I found that I've been using for a few years. I'm like, oh, maybe that wasn't the right usage of the word, or there's a new usage of the word. And the concept of because, reading is ultimately just words put together in a story. And often I think you and I are really in it for the story and the immersion, the experience. Yeah. I often will take now like a screenshot of if I find a beautiful line or a beautiful paragraph that speaks to me, but I'm not really dissecting the book sentence by sentence. I'm taking away the whole story from it.
I agree with you. I just thought of something, but now I forget.
No, story of my life. That's also with reading. It's like you'll think of something and it's like, there's so many thoughts and only so many places to put them, and it happens.
So what?
Anyways, but let's talk about the curriculum and reading. So I always loved to read. Yeah. I loved whenever we had the element of choice. I remember, I probably can't count on one hand, but there were so few instances where they were like, okay, either here's a selection of books that you can choose from, or here's a theme, but the element of choice and also the element of contemporary, because I think for me, it was hard to relate to these characters in Great Expectations. I'm a 15-year-old who's concerned about whether or not the boy sitting across from me is has a crush on me. I don't care about Estella and Pip. And I think that that kind of made it difficult to relate to these stories, and not to say that we shouldn't read different time periods and different authors, but I think I don't even know if we read anything that had been published in the past 10 or 15 years.
So you don't think that Estella and Pip could be a relative thing for girls?
I think that they could, but I don't think, I think I was so removed from the the interesting plots and stuff. That's what I'm saying is I didn't care about that because I felt like they focused so much on the minutia of it that the actually interest. Yes. The teaching, the way that it was.
I feel like you would have liked that book.
Right. No, so maybe I'm being negative to that book particularly, but okay. Something like something like The Yellow Wallpaper. I loved that. That was fascinating. And I wish we would have read more cool shorts. The other thing too is form. I think poetry and short stories and nonfiction, we really just spent a lot of time in our curriculum. And I think I haven't looked at an English syllabus in a long time, but I think a lot of high schools focus on reading these old-fashioned, classic literary fiction classics. And I really don't remember appreciating nonfiction. I think I found that love myself. And I can't really remember reading, did we really read a memoir or a nonfiction piece that wasn't Walden or something? Right. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on how, if there, I've always said if I had all the time and money in the world, I'd love to start a literacy advocacy nonprofit and really start with teaching and the curriculum and getting kids to love reading from a younger age. Because I think once you're out of high school and you already have this negative connotation with reading.
So what are you thinking? Wait, I
don't know. This is all just sort of random thoughts, but I do think, the element of choice is really big. I think letting kids, whether it is here's 10 different books you can pick from, letting them choose anything. I remember maybe more in elementary school, but it was okay, you can choose any book. And then either it was a fun project where it's create a diorama from it or create a cereal box that shows the different plot points, but just getting kids to engage with stories in different ways. And I don't think they have to be maybe quote unquote the highbrow stories, even if it is Nancy Drew, even if it is the Boxcar Children or whatever, it's engaging.
Captain Underpants.
Yeah. And that's engaging with, and plenty of kids books and children's books, when we just talked about it, they get a bad rap, or even young adult fiction. And I've read plenty of young adult fiction that is just as poignant, if not more poignant than adult fiction. I think it's really just all about who's writing it.
Right.
No, I think choice is a big thing. I also think experimenting with what reading means to you, assigning a certain amount of pages each night for the same kids who you don't know what their situation's like at home, saying you have to read 100 pages by Friday, but you don't know if they have the time and the situation.
But on the other hand, they have to do the work. Somebody, the kid
right. No, they have to enforce it, but I'm saying it
has to be done.
I think that's what I'm saying. A looser situation is okay, you have to finish this book, but within the next 2 weeks or something. I think, giving a little more freedom, perhaps.
You have to have everyone read the same book.
I know that's what's hard too. But I'm wondering if maybe you choose more contemporary books that are more appealing to kids, I think that have characters that perhaps they find a little more
idea, because maybe
relatable.
If you gave them more relatable books,
right, then they'd be more invested in it.
They would go back and read, because I have read older books. Right. Now I tend to read modern
You'll say, okay, now you liked this story. Now let's revisit Estella and Pip, like comparing and like I loved even with Romeo and Juliet when we watched the Baz Luhrmann contemporary film, because it really contextualized the entire story, and it's taking something because it's a modern adaptation or something. I mean, was created hundreds of years after the original text, but it's still taking the original text and it's a new spin on it. And so I think also the idea of adaptation and playing with what a story is as well, because I think go ahead.
I'm just thinking. So I think that I know from reading about children's literature. So when I was young, let's say in the 60s, I was born in 61. So up to 9, and then in the early 70s, there wasn't so much YA fiction. That was a newer genre. Like Judy Blume was writing then. So these were new books. They were like brand new, hot off the press. Are you there, God? It's
right.
Me. So it wasn't like, now I feel like it's a totally different landscape.
Right. And I don't think that
we all read the same books as the same way we watched the same TV shows, the kids born in around 1960, whatever. So you're like so far from that. There's so much YA. There's so many books that are more contemporary, even if they're from the 80s, let's say,
right.
Like not from the 40s, because I expected to read like British British books for young people up by E. Nesbitt about time travel and castles and like people going back in time to England, and also just books from the 50s. Like I remember a book called Freckled and 14. I don't even remember the plot.
I think I do. There was like the summer I turned 17 or something. Like I've read some books from the 50s too. And interestingly, they were even some of them I remember reading as a young adult. I didn't even know they were from the 50s. They were literally like rebranded, repackaged as modern books. And I wouldn't look at the publication date. And this was back before Goodreads, back when we would, I would remember, even if I wouldn't buy anything now, first of all, I don't even need to look up new books because they're just finding me everywhere. And my to be read list is like 100 long, but I used to just go to the bookstore and browse around and take note of the books I wanted to read. And that's the other element too, is I feel like giving kids a choice, but also you're right. Everyone has to read the same thing. So like a choice, but limiting.
Maybe they could do smaller groups or something.
Right. Smaller, like here's 3 or 4 things. And I think also playing with what is reading. Like we read just so much fiction and I'm like, well, I want to read nonfiction. I want to read experimental short stories. I want to read memoir. I want to read weird, I don't know. There's just so much, there's more than just fiction. And I love fiction. It's probably what I read the most, of course, but I just think as a young adult, if I was wanting to read, and then, okay, so maybe there's a book about, say you're not quote unquote a reader, there's a book about toys and you're really interested in toys, but from high school, you're like, well, I haven't really read a book since then. And why am I going to want to read this now? Especially if it's a muscle that's out of practice.
It really is a problem because a lot of people who nowadays, don't you think everyone's reading their phones all the time in a way?
Right, like, in a way.
Non-readers who would say they don't read. Whether it's if they're
an
into
article,
dating, they might read about that, or articles, or news, or politics,
or newsletter, or something,
or just Facebook if they're reading.
People, oh my God! I mean,
and then they shift to the article. So I feel like there's more just as there's more typing than certainly my age. People thought they would, people didn't realize we had typing class, but like wouldn't have thought you'd be using it so well. Like I'm so glad I know how to type perfectly.
Was that an optional thing when you were growing up, like typing? No, it was enforced.
Like in 8th grade. My friend's mom was the teacher and she did a great job, and I'm a fantastic typist or typer.
We had to do typing classes too. I mean, now I don't know if are those even a thing now.
You'd be doing it all the time,
right?
Every day, every time. Who knew they didn't teach you how to type?
Well, and handwriting now. So I was
not useful. And nowadays, I write postcards to
I like my handwriting, but I think we were actually just watching the Vietnam War documentary, one of the episodes of the Ken Burns documentary, and just one of the pieces of archival footage with everyone walking in the protest with their signs. And I'm like, oh, their handwriting's all really nice. And now everyone's handwriting now, because we really don't have to do it anymore. You're either typing a note on your phone, or I've also heard, some authors when they talk about their literary process that they literally even just like one author I really like, Melissa Broder, she just records everything on her phone, even like
I never heard of that.
She's really, and I love her. She is one of my favorite authors.
It makes sense. But then how do you edit? Or does she
then has to like put it in like a type to text and then edit it from there.
Because a lot of authors read their work. So after they write it, type it.
No, she will just like record it and then have it typed to text and then like edit it from there, which I think is a really unique, because I feel like a lot of the times part of what holds me back from like my own personal writing is like the idea of taking the thought to typing it. Sometimes I just don't have the accessibility right in the moment, or I like second guess myself too much. But if you just have the recording of you saying it out loud, then that kind of takes away that like second
and also
guessing.
so the book Beautiful Country, I don't know if you read that.
I don't know if I have read that.
Julie Wang.
Yes, I have. So that's what I'm saying is I read.
But she wrote that on her phone, and she started writing it on her phone on the subway.
Yeah, that's in a way, it's cool that we have that. Yeah. I mean, but I also miss the idea of just like handwriting, like even taking notes in school. Like I miss that. And then looking back at my handwritten notes and like seeing the doodles and like the little things I wrote. Right. I still keep a bunch of notes on my phone, but they're usually more like, okay, here's the TV. Well,
handwriting is really important. They say that if you handwrite things, it goes into your brain.
Yeah, you remember it better, right? And so I always thought about that in college, because I was pretty much on the cusp, like as a millennial, of the transition where like in middle school, no one was, we had phones, but no one was really on them. There was no concept of like taking notes on your phones until the iPhone came out, which wasn't until like early high school for me. And I don't remember really taking my computer to school until senior year of high school. And that was the change when I was like, okay, now I'm taking notes on this. And maybe it was also just because I really didn't like high school and didn't care. But like, I feel like I stopped absorbing stuff a lot more then, because there's also the distraction.
I bet it is worse. I know it is worse.
Of the internet too. And so I was at least on the cusp. So I kind of had that choice, like, do I bring a notebook? Do I bring my iPad? Because I had that too in college. And that was really difficult, because I would start out wanting to take notes on it, but it's basically like a phone, like the entire internet's there. So if you want to drift off for a second, I mean, it's hard to stay engaged when you don't have that traditional, just like notepad. And even if you don't have internet connected, it's still like you have the computer. So you're like, let me look at my old photos. Let me do this. Like there is that sort of just like being in the moment of having to physically handwrite it, also because it's like an actual action that requires a little more thought than typing something.
Well, this will surprise you, but I actually handwrite every day, because
you do your postcards, right?
Postcards. So they're with different markers, and it's like coloring. And
well, my mom still writes everything down. Like for me, I pretty much, well, I do have a couple of more like literary writing notes in my phone. They're usually just like reminders or things I need to keep track of. But my mom still has this like little blue book that she literally like writes everything down in and like keeps track of her day in pen. And I'm like, everything's that's a lot. That's hard to keep track of, because what if you lose that? Or what if you don't remember to do something right away?
Of course, if you want to search. That's what search. When did I have that appointment, or when did I do this?
And that's what's kind of nice about the, archive. We have so much to read, and this is kind of maybe where we started getting on the stop. But it's like, I can't keep track of what I read, because there's just so much. But fortunately, because of things like Goodreads, like, you might even mention a book and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I've read that, but then I'll look it up and say, oh, I have, or I haven't. And it's not that book wasn't particularly fantastic or meaningful or any better. I mean, of course, there are ones that really stick out in my mind.
You might forget a title.
Like amazing, but I might forget. It's just like forgetting someone's, like, you're like, oh, who's John Smith? And you're like, oh, I don't know him. But then you see his face and you're like, oh, I know him. I don't know. Because some people are better with names than faces, but I'm way better
in the books. I would say that's why I kind of like I do listen. I don't own all my books, because I do on audio.
Right. So that's what you primarily listen to, audiobooks, right?
I'll talk about that in a sec. But if I have the book, or later, maybe I'll buy it if I love a book, or I'll see it and I'll get it. I do like having them. I do like having them.
Well, it's a physical totem too. It's
the other day I was watching TV and I saw that a book by Jack Finney, he wrote Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but he wrote Time and Again, which is one of my favorite time travel books about New York City. But I also had another book. So up here I had Time and Again, and somewhere else on another shelf I had. Oh, you
literally had them in your house.
And while we're watching TV, they're old. I mean, I had them a long time, decades. But I just like got up and like moved one of them next to the other one. And then Barry said, "Oh yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah,
Like it was bothering me from the corner of my eye that they weren't next. Not that I don't have any organization, but like just those two that were actually in the same.
No, I get you. Yeah.
But I do like having the physical book, even if I did not read the physical book.
Interesting. So you'll buy it if you read it or listen to it, and you didn't own it, and then you'll buy it. Okay, and you won't even necessarily reread it right away. You'll just have it down.
Never ever. So I either have it. Also, sometimes I listened on audio and then I meet the author. I get the book, they sign it, and
a signed book. I have signed books. I love that. Yeah,
those are nice because it's the memory of meeting them and the whole experience. So but it's just I consider it like artwork or something that like
Yeah, no, that's good. It's totally like a little totem,
shelf.
especially if they have a really beautiful cover or it was very meaningful to you or something. That's interesting though. I feel like there's a few times where I may have read the book either from the library or from somewhere else and been like, or, audiobook or Kindle, been like, I need to have this just to physically have it. But I didn't even think about it necessarily as like just a totem of sort of the memory of that.
I do think of it that way. But the other thing is sometimes I've bought the book or I have the book and I couldn't read it, but then I read it on audio. So I actually didn't crack the spine of the book, but maybe then I read it on audio and loved it. So that would be why I would have the book, actually.
No, that makes sense.
I bought it thinking I'm going to read it. Then I'm like, I never got around to that, but maybe I'll try the audio.
Right.
And then the audio is what gets me, because that, to me, you have much more time to listen to audio than to read the book physically sitting down.
Well, because you're a woman of many trades. So you have a lot of other things. And that's what's nice about it is you can absorb the story and still get the experience of reading.
Yeah. And I find that, like, for me, a memoir, if it's read by the author, which many are, then I really want to read I don't want to not have them read it. Like,
if there's the chance to have,
like Bruce Springsteen's autobiography was well read by him.
Right.
I would want him to read that. I don't think I would want to I could read it, but I really want
but it's like them telling you their story in your ear. Yeah. No, I've done the same with some other like celebrity memoirs or like voices that you kind of already know as well. Yeah. And so you feel this like connection to them, and then having it literally in your ear is.
Yeah. And they're reading. There's a book, I can never remember what it's called. Edgar and Lucy by Victor Levant.
Oh, yep. I've read that. I like that. Yeah.
And that was read by him. And I had no idea what that book was.
I really liked that book.
I loved it. I really loved it. And I loved the audio of it.
So he recorded it himself. Okay.
Recorded it. And that I happened to I must have seen, reference coming about the book. I order it. I often don't even remember why I'm getting this book. That happens
Same. I'm like, what is this book about?
Why did I get this? There's another book I got called All Our Wrong Todays. I think
I've read that too.
It also has time travel. And it's read by the author, and it's so good. And like, it was just like the nuance and the tone.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You read that one?
I did.
And so I found the audio. I don't know. I have the book. I think I had bought the book because it sounded good and then did the audio. So again, I didn't, but I also have it to lend it to someone or, just mention it if you're talking, whatever.
Right. Like how often do you often physically pass on these books? Like, are they really more just for you?
They were for me, but during the pandemic, we have an apartment in New York and we were going to sell our house in Belmont. So I actually packed up about 4 or 5 boxes of my favorite books and sent them to New York. So they would just be here. This was a new place to have them here. Then the pandemic came and my son, Jake, and his now fiance lived here for 16 months in this apartment. And she loves to read, Rachel. And I said, wow. I have some really great books for you, like that you should. And I think she read a
curated selection too.
And your favorite books. Curated, and there were really great books. And I would say, like, this one you would like. I'm not saying she would like every book, but like a lot of great books that I think she read.
I mean, you have good taste, and that's what.
And I would know that someone like maybe I read them in my 20s or whatever, like or just someone in their 20s would like them. And she reads all the time, and so that was pretty funny that. Inadvertently, I had created a library when
that's really cool.
During the pandemic, it would have been hard. So she had that, she could read it. And actually, so my sons, I don't think they really read, but Ben's wife has read books that I have, like we'll be in Vermont and we also have books and like, they'll just pick up some books. And last summer, I remember seeing both of them reading, the books.
Isn't that interesting though? Like, I feel like my family reads, but like very rarely, like even growing up, like my mom and my dad and my sister, like I was always reading. I just really don't remember them like reading that much. I mean, there were books around and like my mom still has some books, but like, isn't that interesting how like voracious readers?
My family was so my kids would read when they were kids, but these were like, part of it is almost just the books I thought, I don't know, that they're more focused maybe on like what women would like. So they wouldn't, but they do read, but my parents read all the time. We were visiting them in Florida and they would go in their apartment and they would just be reading.
And like even my boyfriend, like he doesn't read very much. It's like very interesting how I have other friends who do like to read, but you're the only person I really know who like reads with the veracity that I do.
Yes, because I'll always have like I'll always have an audiobook going.
Right. I always have some book that I'm in the middle of.
And I have a lot of books, and I almost feel disappointed in myself because I have so many books, next to my bed or the proverbial shelf that I've now moved them to. I have so many shelves and shelves of books I have.
And the problem is there's books being published every freaking day. So they never end.
Oh, so we talked about this issue briefly, but we didn't really discuss it. I will not finish a book I don't like for that reason, that there's so many.
And I usually don't, because I almost feel like maybe I go in with like a little, I don't usually like read too many reviews. Like I don't even know how I find books like based off of, okay, I like this author, so they're recommending this, or I just follow a lot of random book things throughout my social media. And so I'm always on my phone consuming something. So it just leads to a vicious cycle. But I feel like maybe I just go in thinking that if I've already found a reason to want to read this book, like something intrigued me enough about it, that I'll put it on my to be read list. And I have found, especially the past couple of years, where like since I've found the library and I just have so many books flowing in, like not to mention the books I bought for myself, that I do have to be a little more discerning, even if I'm reading a book every other day, what attention am I giving to that? And so it is interesting to think about, like, I hardly ever finish a book, but is that because I'm already going in with this like preconceived notion that I'm going to like it? And so even if I don't love it, is it like a disappointment to myself that I selected this wrong? I don't know. But
I found when I used to go to the library much more, I was always at the library in Belmont almost every day, dropping off.
Childhood. I mean, I haven't been there in a long time, but
I
a very special place.
Often grab books that I might look at home for 10 minutes or read the book, but like, a lot of books.
So there's no obligation too when you're just going to the library. Yeah. And it's, you're not buying it.
Do I want to read this book or what's it about? And by the way, I want to just clarify, my kids do actually read a lot, but they don't read the same things I do. Whereas Rachel was more likely to want to read the books that I had in my best book, shelf. But they do all read, but very different books. And, that's the other thing about reading is someone else could be a big reader, but they're not reading many books you're reading in your whole life.
So you're like,
a lot of things that they could like music, but it's totally different music.
Totally. So, I mean, that's what's so beautiful about books and literature is there's so many different avenues where, again, it's like that goes back to the literacy thing and the education, where it's like, maybe you don't identify with fiction books, but maybe you find an almanac about dinosaurs. I don't know, just something random, but like that's still reading and exposing yourself to a different form.
You and I, whenever we do talk or text or email, the books that we mention, we have read.
Right. We have very similar interests, I think.
We might read very many other books, but like, I know for you read even more than I do, but like, if I'll say like, oh, I'm seeing this author, or if you read
and especially contemporary, like we're both very tuned into the contemporary literature scene. And so we know sort of like, this is the big book, or I heard this book. I'm sure we have.
I do feel with so many great, like if the person who wrote, Victor Lovato, if he wrote another book, I would want to just read that book.
Just because he wrote it. Totally. Yeah.
Book that I haven't read, but I would want to read his new book because I just love that book so much. And the new Sylvia Plath, which I know.
So that was a 900-page biography. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's my attention. I mean, it's not that it wasn't an engrossing story. It was I didn't know very much about her. So I definitely learned a lot. I almost just felt like there was a little bit of like, again, I'm so big on the narrative element that at times it was like a little more of just like a dissection of her work, which I know totally feeds into the narrative element, but there were like almost like a little too academic or a little too
a writer is an academic.
Right. Which makes sense. So, I'm almost like, I would have loved the 600-page version. I don't think
it's still pretty long, but for me, I'll tell you something. So I felt there were three sections. There was Wellesley, her childhood in Wellesley. There was her college years, and then England. And so each of those could have been a book.
Right.
And so for me, growing up in Newton, next to Wellesley, knowing people who grew up in Wellesley, just knowing Wellesley. Yeah,
I mean, that always also adds an awesome element when it takes place in a place that you've lived.
And also being that much older than you, so that she was still always seemed very old to me, way before me, but she's not as far before me because she's more the age of I know people.
Well, maybe that's what it is too. She's almost like so far out of the reach of like what my life is like that it was almost a little harder to relate to it.
But one of my friend's mothers is in the book. There's a college with her. And there's
that's amazing.
Her name is mentioned, and Sylvia wrote a letter home to her mother.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
My friend's mother saying something about her. So like, that made it feel very real, real.
Yeah, totally.
So the thing is, I found that reading about her poetry was interesting, but I will confess that I also didn't read it all. So
okay.
That to me,
I did read it all.
Okay. Well, I read the whole book, but I let that I was listening a lot on audio. I read the first 200 pages, then listened. So I guess I would listen to try to understand more about her poetry, but I was sort of listening on my own pace to exactly what I wanted to listen to, even though I heard the whole book. I didn't fast forward.
No, you were like tuning. Yeah, no, I feel like I was pretty much fully present. I was tried to be as fully present, like literally the entire Saturday. Jason was like, can we watch this movie? For
you to read that in one day.
Well, no, I didn't read it in one day. No, okay, I spent an entire day reading being engrossed in. No, it took me about 3 or 4 days, which for me is a long time.
It took me a month almost to read that book because
I can imagine if, because that is the equivalent of like 3 books, right?
It's 3 books. I was interviewing the author. I was only going to read it the one time because even if I read it 3 months, I wouldn't have read it again. But like, I just found it so incredible that the fact of the detail in a way was amazing to me, and how she I did read a lot about it, how she put her life into the poetry.
Yes.
Was kind of amazing. So like you understand the poetry from how it really was part of her life, but some of it wasn't part of her life. Some of the things weren't true. So to me, I think sometimes when it's a long book like that, it's almost like it is an epic.
It is an epic, totally.
And so it was very meaningful to me and interesting to me. Oh, and then my mother was in college at the same time she was in college.
So you have that connection too, yeah.
So I was interested to read about college in the 50s. And I also had other friends, many people I know who were in college around that time, older people that I know who were at Smith when she was there or around that time. So I think you had a different, but you had a different lens going into it. Totally. I think for me, I was particularly interested in learning about Smith College and college life in the 50s in this detailed way, which had nothing to do with Sylvia Plath.
Right. And of course, there are certain books that like I have read that I like, or certain maybe more movies where I'm like subjectively, this movie was incredible and super special to me, or just a piece of media. But you understand that like your personal experiences or something that's unique to you makes your perspective on it perhaps different than recommending it to anybody else. But I think for me, I almost went with like a totally different lens and takeaway. Whereas my lens was, I'm not that familiar with Sylvia Plath's work. I'm familiar with her as more of like an icon or sort of like the iconoclast of like, manic pixie dream girl, but also a larger extent, just like her influence on women and contemporary fiction and literature. And now I'm finding a lot of things I've read. Like I just read a really cool memoir called The Red Zone by Chloe Caldwell, all about her period and dealing with PMDD and the connotations of menstrual cycles and how we deal with women. But she brought up like Sylvia Plath's Ariel and how that was potentially like an exploration of PMDD. And those are little things that but now having this context of Sylvia Plath and Ariel. So whether it's something more overt like that, or if someone's just mentioning the bell jar or seeing the influence of her, especially as someone who reads poetry, like I think I understand her a lot more now. And I have more appreciation for these people who are taking her works and seeing their interpretations of it too, because it just shows how much more meaningful she is beyond.
And what we learned in that book is she was not a feminist. She wouldn't have called herself a feminist.
Right. And that's what's so interesting too, is like, what would she have made of her legacy? And also it's the eternal question of what would she have become if she hadn't died at a young age?
Yeah. No. So the whole thing is so haunting in this, but also what the author was trying to do was take her life away from her suicide.
Right.
And that's what, this is a life.
And that was a really beautiful lens too, is the life of Sylvia Plath. It wasn't the death and the aftermath. And that's a whole other book in itself, is her legacy and the exploration. But it was really up until she was alive. And
they're really different. And she was really alive as a person and was,
totally
at times was perfectly happy. And most
and there's and we all I really knew about her was the bell jar and staking her head in an oven. So I'm glad that I got that perspective, especially for someone who is such an icon in literature. And
so I think that's an interesting topic of like, it's educational, like people read it for all different reasons. And I did know almost everything in that book, like not every detail because there's much more in there, but like I had read about her a lot. And
so there was a lot that I didn't. So you had a different, it was almost like coming home to an old friend, whereas I was meeting
I was
happy
to learn it again. I was happy to learn it from the more real story, like to exactly learn what happened and all the detail and everything. And the letters that she had, I mean,
Well, to learn it chronologically too, to really look at this life and not just like, oh, I read this article about her, or did you hear this anecdote?
Or I read the bell jar. Oh,
and it was loving too. You could really tell the amount of care and more than just like, okay, I'm taking this extremely important person's story and legacy, but really giving her grace and giving her she really cared. And the love.
It took 10 years for her to write it.
I mean, I can imagine. That's what I really appreciated too, is even if at times it felt a little bit too like educational or expositional, I appreciated the care and thought that the author put into it. And that's what I really love about reading, is like, this wouldn't have been something that I would have picked up on my own at over 900 pages. I don't think I definitely would not have. And if you hadn't given me the like, go for it and read it. But that's also what's great about
first part if you're not into it.
Yeah, it's just challenging myself. And I could have also just read the first part and given up. And I wanted to keep pushing through. It was a good challenge to myself, because a lot of what I read is.
Well, then I sort of knew you'd have to, because unless you didn't like it, because then you're like, how did this happen?
You can't not stop reading it. Like you need to find out what happens.
They are different sections. They really are different parts. And certainly someone could put it down and read it 3 months later. Then,
right. So it doesn't have to, but I'm a big, like, once I start it, I have to keep going.
So, well, that's why I said just start it. Right. But I also think that book to me was such an epic, because whatever part of 900 pages, like I would still say, like, a person doesn't have to read every word of 900 pages.
Totally.
But at the end of those 900 pages of that book, which was a very beautifully written book, won a lot of awards and all that, if other people will agree that it was an amazing, well-written book, you've really like changed, I think, like having understood even just this person's life and how.
And I think as a reader, it changes also, like, again, even if it's something that's more overt or something more, subconscious and nuanced, like her influence on literature, not just women, just literature, and on the art of reading, and how we also the separation of our author and artist too. And like, mental illness, there's a lot of stuff there that
by the way, you didn't need to know all this stuff. Sorry to interrupt, but you didn't need to know all those people that read her don't even need to know any of this to appreciate it. You did. And people might say, don't read about her to appreciate it. Like, you shouldn't have to know what she did.
I think it just made me appreciate it a lot more. I think a lot more. You don't have to have read it at all, but I think it just really enhances, because I think sometimes we read autobiographies of people and maybe come away being like, maybe they weren't as great a person as I thought, or, and maybe despite all her flaws, like they were shown just as lovingly as the great things. And I also think, she's just a human being. She wasn't like,
she really tried,
right?
Like she tried as much as she could. Anyway, so I found it like she feels now like a person I would know, the same way Anne Gables to me seems like a person I knew. But Sylvia Plath seems much more like fleshed out.
Right. She's not just an author who wrote the jar.
Like,
she's a mother. She's a human being. She's a wife.
Her mother, I was going to say, like the way she portrayed her mother, but this book is very thoughtful about her mother, and her mother tried so hard. I think. Yeah,
there's a lot of family dynamics too, beyond just Sylvia herself, that I found. I'm always interested in family.
Well, I guess I'm just saying it as an example of a book that just really affects you, changes you, educates you, makes you feel like you've learned something, or how a person can live the way she lived and what it was like for her. There's nothing to do that we would live like that, but it's for her. What was it? At least what we can think it might have been like for her.
Well, I could keep talking to you for hours. I think for the sake of brevity for our listeners, maybe that is a good note to end us off on. But maybe, if you guys liked this episode, let us know what you think. And maybe we'll have Jenny back on again. Maybe she'll be our sort of unofficial, every time we can like deep dive into some books.
Other topics.
I guess we'll leave a parting question is, what are you reading right now?
I don't know. I'm not really reading. I'm not.
That's okay.
I'll tell you why. Because one of my friends, Jean Hanff Korelitz, who wrote The Plot and has a brand new book coming out. She has a brand new book coming out this month. I think it's called The Latecomer. It is called The Latecomer.
Are you waiting for that to come out?
I've really been waiting for that because I heard about it over a year ago.
So, interesting. So you're the type of person, if you know a book is coming out that you really want to read, does that prevent you from like reading something else?
No, I'm going to tell you why. No, I'll tell you why. What prevented me with this. So a few months ago, I didn't realize. I saw on Twitter, she just said, I'm reading this book, Sunshine Girl by Juliana Margulies from She just said, I'm reading this book on audio. She said, it's a great audio.
She's the actor, right? Juliana Margulies. Yeah.
Okay. So I had never seen her in anything, but at Jean's recommendation on Twitter, I thought, and I love audio. Jean is the person actually who told me speed up your books, which I once said like, I'm speeding up to like 1.4 or 5 even. And she goes, I go faster than that.
made you feel justified in that.
Yeah. Well, I do now go faster. She taught me to do that. So if once I'm into it, and you can go faster, I think after you're into it.
Yes, definitely.
Anyway, so then after I read that book, which is a good book, I said, oh, to my husband, like, let's watch an episode of ER. I've never seen ER. Well, that was about March 1st. And I'm now on, I just finished season 11.
And you got to do The Good Wife next. Isn't she in that too? So I haven't actually watched that either. I just know her.
So it has cut into my reading. I'm reading somewhat. I've read something in between, but a few things in between. But the ER has really very uncharacteristically cut into my reading because it's
that captivating. Yeah. Well,
but
that's okay.
Fun, but it started from a book. So that's
that's okay. We'll excuse you then.
So, all right.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come and chat with me. And for everyone else, until next time, stay reading.